Genealogy is the study of family history and lineage. It involves gathering information about your ancestors and their life stories. What happens when you want to add DNA results to your genealogy story? This can be a daunting task, especially when it comes to dealing with the ethical dilemma of revealing certain family secrets. Today, we'll discuss how to add DNA results to your genealogy story while navigating this sensitive issue. Howdy, I'm Devin Noel Lee, and welcome to Write Your Family History, where I teach you how to quickly and easily write your family histories to preserve your legacy for the future. So today, let's start with this ethical dilemma. The first question you must ask yourself is how and when to add DNA results to your genealogy story. To answer how and when to add DNA results to your story, you may need to consider the following ethical principles as recommended by other genealogists. Do no harm. Be kind. Do not shame. As mentioned in a previous webinar about writing ethically, it's impossible to do no harm and still tell the truth. And by not telling the truth, we might actually be doing harm. To learn more about that webinar, check for the link in the description box. So, how do we tell the truth even though it can be harmful? Let's consider a couple of principles. Be objective, be accurate, and insert the discovery where it makes sense. When and how to insert DNA discoveries into a story so that it makes sense is something we're going to focus on in today's video. The easiest situation involves DNA results that are sought after and do not necessarily upset the family. For example, if you have been trying to locate a missing ancestor and DNA results confirm their identity, then adding this information to your family tree is a good idea. If the ancestor extends the family line, treat the new discovery with DNA evidence as you would any other source. For instance, I validated the identity of William James Townsend's siblings using DNA, and he happens to be my second great-grandfather. As I write William's story, when he was a child and a young adult living near these siblings, I could write as if I had city directories, census records, church records, and so forth, telling their collective story. Since the relationships are unclear via those records, I could add a DNA source citation when mentioning their relationship. To access DNA source citation ideas, be sure to check the link in the description box. How I made the discovery using DNA evidence may require a little further explanation. Therefore, I suggest using the appendix section to explain how I confirmed the family's relationships using DNA test results and triangulations. Does that make more sense? Let me know if you need more clarification by leaving a comment below. Another relatively easy situation involves adding unknown biological parents to an ancestor's story that doesn't necessarily upset the family. For instance, my grandmother was adopted as a baby. She knew she was adopted from the time she was 6 years old. After her death, my husband figured out the identity of her biological father using DNA triangulation. In short, discovering that Delbert Hankinson was the biological father of Marie Anderson did not upset our family, but was rather exciting. However, when do I include the identity of Delbert in Granny's story? Well, where does it make sense? I recommend keeping his identity unknown throughout the lifetime of Granny's story. For instance, I would indicate in her story that Granny was born Marie Anderson to Agnes Anderson, who died without disclosing the identity of Marie's father. Since Agnes died the day of Marie's birth, Marie was adopted by Harry and Laura Long, and her name became forever after known as Louise Long. Now, I would continue Louise's story without mentioning her biological father, but in an epilogue or an appendix section, I could then mention the discovery of Delbert Hankinson as her father. Why am I doing this? Louise died without that knowledge. After her death, my two aunts took DNA tests, and then the knowledge came to light. So, what I'm advocating is don't change Louise's story to something she did not know during her lifetime. Let me know your thoughts about that strategy in the comments below. If you write about an adoptee discovering their parentage through DNA testing, you must approach the situation with compassion and empathy. Notice I'm not necessarily talking about an adoptee that is you. If it is your story, then include it where it makes the more sense that you discovered the identity of the missing biological parent. But we're talking about writing about an adoptee that is not yourself. Work with the adoptee to tell their story. I suggest you keep their story private until they are ready to release it. If your adoptee is living, share your story draft with them and let them decide when and what format the story can be released to others and when they want to include the identity of this biological parent in their story. In other words, put them in the driver's seat. If you're writing about an adoptee who is recently deceased and the revelation is shocking to living relatives, share their story with those most affected by the news. Work together to decide when the information can be more widely released. While you write the story and await permission to share, how do you tell the adoptee's life story? My recommendations change depending on when the adoptee knew and when they knew it. Write about those factors. If a child knew they were adopted from their earliest memory, then you can write about the facts earlier in their story about the adoption and the biological relatives. Then you can follow the story from the time they sought after their parentage, follow their story on the quest for discovery, and the final results if they happen to learn it during their lifetime. If a person did not know they were adopted until later in life, write their life story as if the parents they thought were their biological parents were in fact their biological parents. When their adoption is revealed to them, that is a plot shift. And from that point on in the story, you may discover or write about the search for the biological parents. Notice how the story follows the knowledge of the adoptee through their life rather than insert facts before they were entered into evidence. I hope I'm being clear. And as with every example I share, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Agree, disagree, or share follow-up questions. Perhaps the most delicate story to write is that of a living person who discovers an unexpected parental change. This can be yourself, but the tips I'm giving are really about someone else in your family, a close relative or a cousin or whoever that you know. When they discover their parents aren't who they thought they were, what do you do? But before I tell you what exactly to do, let's get in the right mindset. First, you must respect the shocked person's wishes and allow them time to process their information at their own pace. They may need time to come to terms with the news, so don't pressure them into sharing their results. Next, tell their story as they knew it, similar to the adoptee who didn't know they were adopted until later in life, which we discussed earlier. Unless the living person prefers this opener, avoid telling their birth story in this fashion. My birth parents were Robert Doe and Penny Joe, but I wouldn't know that until many years later. I don't really think that fits in their story. Tell their story as if the adopted parents or the person who isn't biological, but they were part of their early childhood years, write as if they were, and then make the story shift when the knowledge becomes revealed. So here's an example. I was born 2 years after Robert and Helen Noe were married. And then you continue the story until age 56. And then it continues like this. At the age of 56, I discovered that my father, Robert, was not my biological father. I was shocked, I was hurt, and continue your story. And don't be afraid to include your personal emotions. And then if you are writing about someone else, she was shocked, she was hurt. It took her a while to process and continue in that faction. If that is too traumatic for a living person, then write their living story without mentioning the biological parent. When you conclude their story, you can add an appendix section that discusses their unexpected biological parentage discovery. You do not have to publish this section until after the subject of the story is deceased or whenever they're ready to have that section added. Again, the correct approach will be guided by the person who is experiencing the shocking discovery that the people who they thought were their parents are not biological. Sometimes you uncover an unexpected secret about an ancestor using DNA evidence. Perhaps you discover that a mother, grandfather, or great uncle had a child that their descendants and extended family did not know about it. How do you write that story? Well, it depends on whether the relative may have known about the birth of a child. Women will know they gave birth to children, but men don't always learn these details, if at all. If you're writing about a mother who hid a secret about their child's birth, then proceed in a way similar to this. Frances Fran gave birth to Johnny John on 16 May 1924. While Johnny's birth record says his father is Marky Mark, Frances held a secret about Johnny's biological father. No one would know until long after her death. Then tell the story of Johnny John being Marky Mark's son for all intents and purposes. Finish Frances Fran's life story as she wanted it told. Epilogue reveals the discovery of Johnny John learning about the biological father he didn't know about and Frances never revealed. If Frances Fran gave birth to a child and gave it up for adoption, but never told the family about it, what do you do then? Perhaps it would be beneficial to mention her experiences and choices when they happened within the chronology of her story. If she never met her secret child, then include the child's identity in the epilogue or appendix. If she did meet the child later in life, include those events when they happened. What if Frances Fran gave birth to a child and was told it was dead rather than being placed for adoption? Well, I would follow the same procedures as I mentioned for Fran actually placing the child for adoption. And then if she discovers it later in life, include it that revelation when it happens. If she never discovers it during her lifetime, then you put it in the epilogue. Does this pattern start to make sense? Now, what about the men? If a man had an illegitimate child while married to another woman, you could mention his infidelity when it happened. However, you can't necessarily write the child into his overall story if he didn't interact with the child throughout his life. However, do include the child's identity either when the man discovered the child's identity or again, utilize that epilogue or appendix to a story. If an unmarried man had intimate relationships with an unmarried woman, but they parted ways and then she gave birth to that child without informing him, how do you handle that situation? Well, you could mention his oat sowing ways at the time of his life. Make a judgment of whether you want to tease that those ways had hidden consequences. I'll leave that up to you. If he does learn that he has a child during his lifetime, then I would tease the consequences. If he didn't know, then include the child's identity and again, that epilogue or appendix. Those are my recommendations, but I want to hear what you think or what you've decided. Now, I cannot cover all the possible scenarios, but I hope you find that this is starting to make sense. I recommend telling a person's life story as it unfolded, including biological realities as the individual knew them. If the realities were never known by the persons creating or impacted by them, insert the action of creation when it happens, but save the result of those acts into a section that's separate from the person's life story. We have one more topic to cover, and that is when do you publish the stories about DNA discoveries? In the webinar about writing ethically, I share a number of suggestions on when to tell the stories and make it publicly available and in what format. But let's go ahead and discuss a couple of things for your consideration. First, you do not have to publish books about individuals or recently deceased persons for public consumption. If you write a story with a shocking or painful DNA discovery, guard them closely until the persons involved are ready to share them or they have passed on. So you could print a copy and put it in your house. And if these relatives come by, then maybe you need to put them in a storage place so they don't find it until they're ready to see them. Now, make plans for your stories to find a home for access by relatives after you pass away. Document reality, but make your discoveries accessible for those who want them later. When you've passed away, they can't yell at you for telling the hard truth. With careful consideration and sensitivity, DNA testing can enhance your genealogical story and bring you closer to discovering the truth about your family. Before you leave, just remember, Write Your Family History is a channel that grows based on your comments and your questions. To ensure that your questions are seen and considered for future videos, leave them under the relevant videos on this channel. If I invite you to share more context to your questions, I'll invite you to send me an email. Otherwise, I actually answer comments on videos before I respond to emails. So start sharing your questions and comments now.